October 1971. Game 7 of the World Series. Steve Blass stood on the mound at Memorial Stadium in Baltimore, with the Pittsburgh Pirates season resting on every pitch he threw. The afternoon light settled over the concrete ballpark. Black and gold moved against Baltimore's orange and black, and the sound of the crowd rolled through the upper deck as Blass kept taking the baseball and getting outs. He had already pitched a complete game victory earlier in the series. Now, in the deciding game, he did it again. He started Game 7, finished it, and walked off as the winning pitcher on a world championship team. Across those two starts against the Orioles, Blass worked all 18 innings. He allowed 7 hits and 2 runs. Roberto Clemente was voted the World Series most valuable player, with Blass finishing second. And more than half a century later, Blass remains the last National League pitcher to throw a complete game in Game 7 of a World Series. If your first World Series memories came from that era, you may remember how October baseball looked and sounded before postseason games became late-night television. Maybe it reached you through a picture that needed adjusting, with the crowd pouring from a small speaker and the autumn daylight changing across the field. A starting pitcher was expected to carry the game as far as he could. On that afternoon, Steve Blass carried it all the way.
That should have been the image permanently attached to his name. The ball in his right hand, the final game of the season under his control, Pittsburgh won victory from a championship. But baseball would eventually use the name Steve Blass for something else. In 1973, only 2 seasons after the World Series, and 1 season after the best regular year of his career, Blass walked 84 batters in 88 2/3 innings. He struck out only 27. His earned run average rose to 9.85. One of the National League's best pitchers had suddenly lost the ability to throw the baseball where he wanted it to go. There was no ordinary decline leading into it. Blass had not spent years fading from the top of the rotation. In 1972, he won a career-high 19 games, made the National League All-Star team, and finished second to Steve Carlton in the Cy Young Award voting. He entered 1973 with every outward sign of an established major league star. Then the command disappeared so completely that the game eventually turned his name into a diagnosis: Steve Blass disease, baseball shorthand for a talented player who inexplicably and permanently loses the ability to throw accurately. The phrase survived. It was later applied to players such as Rick Ankiel, Mark Wohlers, Dontrelle Willis, Ricky Romero, and Daniel Bard. Each new case carried Blass's name forward, even for fans who had never seen him pitch. But the label can distort the man behind it.
It makes the collapse sound like the whole story, when it followed years of real accomplishment. To understand what vanished in 1973, you first have to understand what Steve Blass had built and how long it had taken him to build it. Stephen Robert Blass came from Canaan, Connecticut, and attended Housatonic Valley Regional High School in nearby Falls Village. The Pittsburgh Pirates signed him in 1960 when he was 18 years old. He did not arrive with the physical profile of an overpowering workhorse. Blass was listed at 6 feet tall and 165 pounds. Yet his career would be defined at its best by durability, complete games, shutouts, and the expectation that once he took the mound, he could remain there until the decision was final. 4 years after signing, he reached the majors. Blass made his debut on May 10, 1964, against the Milwaukee Braves. He pitched 5 innings, allowed only 2 hits, walked 2, struck out 2, and did not surrender an earned run. It was an encouraging first appearance, but it did not immediately secure his place in Pittsburgh. He would not join the Pirates permanently until 1966. That distinction matters. The pitcher who eventually conquered a World Series was not an overnight creation.
Pittsburgh signed him, developed him, brought him up, and gave him the time to become a major league starter. Blass never wore another major league uniform. From his first appearance to his last, his baseball identity belonged to the Pirates.
By 1968, he was ready to become far more than a pitcher simply holding his place on the staff. That summer, the Pirates still played at Forbes Field, the old ballpark set into Pittsburgh's Oakland neighborhood. Its enormous outfield and ivy-covered brick walls belonged to a different age of the game. The dimensions demanded patience from hitters and nerve from outfielders. For a pitcher working in that broad green space, every inning unfolded beneath the same scoreboard and steel framework that generations of Pittsburgh fans had known. Those fans watched Blass win 18 games in 1968. His earned run average was 2.12, and he threw 7 shutouts, 7 games in which he allowed no runs and remained on the mound for the final out. Baseball remembers 1968 as the year of the pitcher, a season dominated by exceptional performances on the mound. Even in that environment, Blass's numbers established him as one of the National League's best. He was no longer a young pitcher trying to prove he belonged. Opposing teams could go an entire afternoon or evening without scoring against him. And as the season reached September, Blass became even more difficult to beat. Picture Forbes Field in those closing weeks, the deep outfield beginning to fall into shadow, the brick and ivy beyond it, the crisp sound of the ball reaching the catcher as another at-bat ended. The season was nearly spent, but Blass was pitching as though he had found another gear. In September, he went 5-1 with a 1.65 ERA and 46 strikeouts. The National League named him its Player of the Month. For anyone who learned baseball in an old neighborhood park like Forbes Field, those surroundings may still define what the major leagues first looked like. The irregular walls, the open daytime sky, and a starting pitcher expected to finish the work he began. In 1968, Steve Blass fit that world perfectly. The September award mattered because it confirmed that his season was more than a promising stretch. Blass had finished stronger than he started. At 26 years old, after 8 years in the Pirates organization, he had emerged as a frontline major league pitcher. The championship performance that would define his peak was still 3 years away. So was the season that would place him second in the Cy Young vote. Before baseball attached his name to a mystery, Steve Blass was still climbing, and the best years of his career had only begun. In 1969, Blass followed his breakthrough with 16 more wins and a career-high 147 strikeouts. The shutouts and earned run average shifted from season to season, as they do for almost every pitcher, but the larger direction remained clear. Pittsburgh had developed someone it could trust with a regular turn in the rotation, and the team around him was changing too. The Pirates were moving into one of the strongest periods in franchise history, a 5-year stretch that would produce 4 National League East titles.
Forbes Field gave way to Three Rivers Stadium in 1970. The old brick, ivy, and neighborhood asymmetry disappeared. In their place came a circular concrete stadium beside Pittsburgh's rivers, with synthetic turf and the brighter colors of a new baseball decade. The setting changed. Blass kept winning. From 1969 through 1972, he won 60 games. That kind of total requires more than one brilliant month or one memorable October. It means taking the ball across 4 full seasons, absorbing the ordinary starts between the highlights, and giving a contender enough quality innings to keep returning to the top of its division. By 1971, Blass was part of a Pittsburgh team ready to do more than reach the postseason. The Pirates won the National League pennant and faced the Baltimore Orioles in the World Series. Baltimore won the first 2 games, but Pittsburgh recovered and forced the series all the way to a 7th. That brought Blass back to the mound at Memorial Stadium. His Game 7 complete game was extraordinary on its own.
Placed inside the full arc of his career, it becomes even more revealing. He had already been one of the National League's better pitchers for several seasons. He had led the league with 5 shutouts that year. When Pittsburgh reached the game that would decide everything, the Pirates were asking an established starter to deliver at the level he had already shown. He did.
Across his 2 complete game victories in the series, Blass allowed just 2 runs in 18 innings. Clemente's performance earned the Most Valuable Player award, and Blass finished second in the voting. Together, they stood at the heart of Pittsburgh's championship. For Blass, Clemente was more than a celebrated teammate. He was a close friend. That relationship would later become entangled in public attempts to explain what happened to Blass, but in October 1971, their names were connected by triumph. Clemente was the series MVP. Blass was the pitcher who finished Game 7. A career can sometimes appear to crest at a moment like that. The championship is won, the defining image is secured, and everything afterward feels like a descent. Blass went in the other direction. In 1972, at age 30, he won 19 games, the highest total of his career. He was selected to the National League All-Star team. When the Cy Young votes were counted, only Steve Carlton finished ahead of him. That second-place finish matters because of where it sits in the timeline. Blass was not surviving on the reputation of the World Series. He had just completed his best regular season and received recognition as one of the finest pitchers in the league. There were imperfect numbers within that success, including 84 walks in 1972. But the total season still produced 19 victories, an all-star selection, and a place directly behind Carlton in the Cy Young race. Nothing in the larger result resembled the long, visible erosion that usually warns everyone a pitcher is nearing the end. When the 1972 season closed, Steve Blass had 100 major league victories within reach, a championship already behind him, and every reason to remain an important part of a perennial contender. Then came 1973. At Three Rivers Stadium, baseball arrived differently than it had at Forbes Field. The ball skipped across synthetic turf. The Pirates' black and gold uniforms stood out against the broad green surface, surrounded by concrete decks that curved around the field. Fans who made the move from Forbes to Three Rivers knew they were watching the same franchise in a completely different home. They also knew the pitcher on the mound. They had seen Blass become an 18-game winner. They had watched him help deliver a championship. Only the year before, he had won 19 and nearly captured the Cy Young Award. His motion, his uniform, and his place in the rotation were all familiar. The result no longer was. Through the 1973 season, the most fundamental act in pitching became unreliable. Blass walked 84 batters in 88 2/3 innings, almost 1 walk for every inning he worked. He struck out only 27. He also hit 12 batters, the highest total in the National League that year. A pitcher can survive hits. He can adjust when his velocity drops or when hitters begin recognizing a favorite pitch. Lost command is different. Every plate appearance threatens to lengthen. Every runner who reaches without putting the ball in play adds pressure to the next delivery. The pitcher still knows the dimensions of the strike zone. His career proves he knows how to reach it. But the ball no longer follows that knowledge with dependable accuracy. Blass's earned run average rose to 9.85. In simple terms, opponents were producing runs against him at a rate completely removed from the pitcher he had been. By the measure known as wins above replacement, his season registered at minus 3.9, still the worst for any pitcher in the modern era. That figure can make the season sound almost abstract, like an entry at the bottom of a leaderboard. The human reality was more immediate. A recent Cy Young runner-up was trying to complete major league innings while the margin for error vanished pitch by pitch.
If you watched the Pirates at Three Rivers in those years, perhaps you remember the uneasiness that could spread through a ballpark when a pitcher suddenly could not find the plate. The count changed on the scoreboard. Another batter waited. Another runner took his base. For a fan, it was tension. For the pitcher at the center of it, it threatened the profession he had spent his adult life mastering. The timing invited an explanation. During the offseason before the 1973 collapse, Roberto Clemente had died suddenly. Clemente was Blass's teammate and close friend.
Because the loss came just before Blass lost his command, the two events were later connected by people trying to solve an otherwise inexplicable change. Blass himself said the grief associated with Clemente's death was not the cause. That distinction has to stand. The friendship was real. The loss was real. So was Blass's own rejection of the theory. Connecting two events on a calendar does not give anyone else the authority to turn them into a diagnosis, and no other definitive explanation emerged from the record. There was no simple injury that accounted for the transformation. There was no ordinary aging curve to follow from the previous season. Baseball had a result it could measure in walks, earned runs, and innings. It did not have a supported answer for why it was happening. The mystery remained, but Blass still had to pitch through its consequences. On April 17, 1974, one day before his 32nd birthday, he faced the Chicago Cubs in what became his final major league game. 3 years had passed since the World Series victory in Baltimore. Less than 2 had passed since the Cy Young runner-up season. Blass worked 5 innings. He allowed 5 hits and 5 earned runs. He struck out 2 and walked 7. At Three Rivers, the game moved through those 5 innings with the familiar sounds of the era, the organ carrying through the concrete bowl, announcements from the public address system, spikes and baseballs meeting artificial turf.
The name on the scoreboard still belonged to a World Series hero. The line forming beneath it told a different story. 7 walks meant 7 trips to first base without the Cubs needing a hit. Blass kept working long enough to record 15 outs, but the command had not returned. When his appearance ended, so did his major league career, though that would only become certain with time. For viewers who were young Pirates fans then, a scene like that could alter an early understanding of the game. The players on television cards and postseason highlight reels had once seemed permanent. Blass's last season showed how quickly even a proven major leaguer could become vulnerable to something no one could see and no statistic could explain. He spent most of 1974 in the minor leagues, searching for a way back. The contrast was severe. In 1972, he had been second in the National League Cy Young voting. 2 seasons later, he was no longer able to hold a major league place. The game offers pitchers endless opportunities to repeat their mechanics, make adjustments, and try again. For Blass, repetition did not produce a lasting recovery. He retired in March 1975, and the Pirates released him on March 27. He was 32 years old. Only 2 months after his retirement, Roger Angell chronicled Blass's ordeal in an essay for The New Yorker. The timing helped move the story beyond Pittsburgh.
What Blass had experienced became part of the broader language and literature of baseball, an elite athlete losing access to a basic skill without a satisfying explanation. Eventually, the game attached his name to the phenomenon. Steve Blass disease became baseball shorthand for a talented player who suddenly and inexplicably loses the ability to throw accurately. For position players, a similar problem would sometimes be called Steve Sax syndrome. Over the years, Blass's name was invoked in discussions of Rick Ankiel, Mark Wohlers, Dontrelle Willis, Ricky Romero, Daniel Bard, and others. The phrase is not a formal diagnosis. It is a piece of baseball vocabulary, born from the urge to name something the sport still cannot fully explain. And that vocabulary created a strange kind of immortality. Fans who never saw the 1968 shutouts, the 1971 World Series, or the 19 victories in 1972 could still recognize the name Steve Blass.
They simply knew it for the worst thing that had happened to him. That is where the public memory of his career can become incomplete. Blass's collapse was historic, and removing it would mean avoiding the central truth of his story. But it occupied 2 seasons at the end of a 10-season Major League career. Before it, he had become one of the National League's best pitchers. He had thrown 57 complete games and 16 shutouts. He had struck out 896 batters and worked more than 1,597 innings. Most importantly to Blass, he had won.
His final record was 103 victories and 76 losses, with a 3.63 career earned run average. He won more than 100 games for the only major league organization he ever represented. He contributed to a sustained period of Pirates' success, and twice went the distance in a World Series his team won by a single deciding game. Those achievements did not erase 1973. They gave it scale. Baseball did not watch an unproven pitcher fail to establish himself. It watched a proven one lose a skill he had demonstrated thousands of times. After his playing career, Blass stayed in the Pittsburgh area. In the late 1970s, he worked as a salesman for Jostens, the company known for school class rings. It was work far removed from starting a World Series game, and it came during the years before baseball offered him a different route home. In 1983, the Pirates brought Blass into their television and radio broadcasts as a part-time color commentator. 3 years later, the role became full-time. The player who had once communicated through pitches now helped explain the game from the booth. His connection to Pittsburgh no longer depended on finding the strike zone. It depended on his knowledge of baseball and on the relationship he had built with the city over decades. For Pirates fans who heard Blass during those years, his voice became part of the routine of a season. The television broadcast in the living room, the radio carrying a home game, baseball filling another summer evening in western Pennsylvania. Younger viewers could come to know him first as a broadcaster, then discover that the man describing the action had once finished Game 7 of a World Series. That reversal matters. The phrase attached to his collapse traveled throughout baseball, but in Pittsburgh, Blass remained a person rather than a condition. He was still present, still a Pirate. Before the 2005 season, he chose to limit his announcing work to home games so he could spend more time with his family. He remained in the booth until retiring from broadcasting in 2019. By then, his combined life as a Pirates player and broadcaster had covered 60 years. 60 years with one organization changes the proportions of the story. The lost command lasted long enough to end his playing career. The relationship with the Pirates lasted long enough to encompass nearly an entire adult life. It carried Blass from a teenage signing in 1960 through Forbes Field and Three Rivers Stadium, through a world championship, a public collapse, years away from the game, and more than 3 decades behind a microphone. In 2012, Blass released his autobiography, A Pirate for Life, co-written with Eric Sherman.
The book addressed the throwing struggle, but its title placed that struggle inside the larger identity Blass had chosen for himself. A decade later, in 2022, the Pirates named him an inaugural member of the organization's Hall of Fame. Blass was never elected to the National Baseball Hall of Fame. His career totals do not resemble the usual statistical standards for Cooperstown. That was never the necessary measure of this story. His place in baseball history came from a rarer combination: a genuine pitching peak, one of the game's great championship performances, a collapse so mysterious it entered the language, and a return to the same community that had witnessed all of it. Years later, Blass said he was content with how his career had unfolded. He pointed to 10 good years with the Pirates, more than 100 victories, and the chance to pitch in a World Series. That was his answer to a game that had spent decades repeating his name as a synonym for failure. There is still no supported explanation for why Steve Blass lost his control. The search for one became part of the story, but it never produced a conclusion. His pitching career ended because the command did not come back. His baseball life continued anyway. So the lasting image does not have to be another walk in 1973 or the final pitching line in April 1974. It can return to Baltimore in 1971, when Blass held the ball for all 9 innings of Game 7 and completed the work of a world championship.
And it can extend beyond that afternoon, to the Pittsburgh broadcast booth, to a 60-year bond with one organization, and to the perspective of a man who refused to let the unexplained ending take ownership of everything that came before it. Baseball gave his name to a mystery. Steve Blass gave Pittsburgh an entire lifetime.